Hi, Applications of Functions 1 students. Welcome to your first day of video notes. Today we're going to talk about Module 0, Day 1 on integers. And before we get to the integer part, the math part, I want to talk to you just what I mean about when I say Module 0. So our textbook is written in modules instead of chapters. There are 5 total modules that you guys will cover over the next 2 years for Applications of Functions 1 and 2. Our book starts with Module 1, but I'm going to start with Module 0. What I mean by that is there are some important topics I want to go over with you guys that are called prerequisite topics, things you guys have learned in the past, but they're important enough that I wanted to review with you again before we start. And that's what I mean by Module 0. Alright, so today we're going to start with integers. And the word integers, it's an important word to know. What it means is any whole number. Now that can include positive numbers, negative numbers, and 0. But it cannot be a fraction or a decimal. So 0 is an integer, 10 is an integer, -7 is an integer, 100 million is an integer. What are not integers are things like 1/2 or 2.7. Anything that's not a whole number, anything that's only part of a number is not an integer. Now, when we say we're going to talk about integers, what we're really focused on is the concept of positives and negatives, and that's what we want to talk about today. So we're going to talk about all the different math operations with integers and how it works out. So let's start with multiplying and dividing, which is actually the easier of the two. It's funny because people think adding and subtracting would probably be easier, but when it comes to knowing rules for integers, I think multiplying and dividing is easier. So first of all, start with the easy one. Whether you're multiplying or dividing, that's why I said times or divided by, positive times positive or positive divided by positive is always positive. That's nice and simple. So here, I'll just make up a quick example here. If I do 4 times 3, you say, well, 4 times 3 is 12. Positive times positive, no tricks here. So my answer is just 12. Now, negative times negative, or negative divided by negative, also positive. So I'll use dividing for this example. Let's say I do -10, and I'll put parentheses just to show it's a negative number, divided by -2. Well, the first thing you do is the number part. You say 10 divided by 2 is 5, and then at the end of the question, you have to decide whether the answer is positive or negative. And for this one, it's going to be positive, because that's our rule. Negative divided by negative is a positive. Now the last rule, one of each, meaning one positive and one negative. Doesn't matter what order it can go. It can be negative times positive or positive divided by negative. If it's one positive number, one negative number, and you are multiplying or dividing, the answer will always be negative. So this time, let's say I have -8 times +4. So for this question, I would do the multiplying part first. I would say, well, 8 times 4 is 32. And then I would look back at the question and say, well, it's negative times positive. That's one of each. My rule for one of each when I'm multiplying or dividing is that the answer is always negative. So -8 times 4 would be -32. All right, let's wrap up today by talking about adding and subtracting with both positive and negatives. And before we talk about how to do that, I want to remind you guys of something that you've learned in the past, a very important concept. Adding and subtracting are basically the same thing. Subtracting is just adding a negative number. So the way I worded it for the notes, I said you can always change any subtraction problem into an addition problem by changing the sign of the number that's being subtracted. So let's say, for example, let me just do a simple subtraction problem here. We have 10 minus 6. Now the answer is 4, but I'm not really concerned with the answer. What I'm concerned with is you guys realizing that that's the same as having 10 plus -6. So every subtraction problem can be turned into adding the opposite. Here's a couple more examples. It might go over where I wrote there. Actually, maybe I can get rid of that so it won't be an issue for us. All right. Okay. So we have 8 minus 10. And I said that is the same as 8 plus -10. So I want you guys to notice the first number, the 8, stays the same. What's changing is the number being subtracted. Remember what I said up here? It's the number being subtracted. So instead of -10, I called it plus -10. Or here's a second example. -13 minus -2 is the same as -13 plus +2. So again, the first number didn't change. We have a -13, that's going to change. The second number is what changes. So I am subtracting a negative number. If I want to turn it into an addition problem, it turns into a positive number. Or what a lot of you guys have probably done in the past is this. You see, when you see subtracting a negative, you turn them both into pluses like this. And you go, okay, well, instead of subtracting a negative, I'm adding a positive. And that's the idea there. And the reason that's important is because what we want to do is just make a set of rules for adding. We want to say, I don't need a separate set of rules for what to do when I'm subtracting. Because if I have a subtraction problem, I'll just turn it into addition, and then I can remember the rules for those. So here are going to be our rules for adding with positive and negative numbers. Start with an easy one. Positive plus positive is always positive. So again, nice simple question. Let's say I had 6 plus 3. 6 plus 3 is 9. We wouldn't even think about it. We wouldn't even think, well, is the answer positive or negative? That's just an easy question. Okay, number 2. Negative plus negative is always negative. So let me make up an example for that. Let's say we had -7 plus -5. Now the rule is, don't get it confused with your multiplication rules. If it's a multiplication, negative times negative is positive. But this answer is not going to be positive, it's going to be negative. When you're adding two negative numbers like this, just add the numbers themselves. You say 7 plus 5 is 12. So I'm going to add those. But because they were both negative, so is my answer. So -7 plus -5 is actually -12. Now the last one is one of each, and that's one that's a little tricky. So when you have one each, let's say I'm adding one positive number with one negative number. This is the one that it's not always one or the other. The answer can be positive or negative. And the way you know is by which of the two was the bigger number. And I said bigger because bigger doesn't mean like positive is bigger than negative. It means of the two numbers themselves, the number part, which one is bigger. So basically, oh, and the other thing is you're going to subtract here. If you're adding one positive number and one negative number, to get the actual number part of the answer, you subtract those two. So for example, let's say I was doing 6 plus -9. So I recognize that I'm adding one positive and one negative, and I realize that for the number part, I don't want to add them up. The number part of my answer is not going to be 15 here. I want to subtract those two numbers. So I take them and I say, okay, I have a 9 minus 6 would give me a 3. And then I have to decide whether or not my answer is positive or negative. So when I look at the two numbers, the bigger number of the two is the 9. And the 9 was negative, so my answer is negative. Now for another example, maybe I did -3 plus +8. And I'll put the -3 in parentheses just so we can see it again. Same thing, one of each. One positive, one negative. So the very first thing to figure out the number part, once I realize that, I subtract. 8 minus 3 is 5. Now this time, the bigger number was the 8, and the 8 was positive, so my answer stays positive, and my answer is positive 5. So these are our rules for add, subtract, multiply, and divide with positive and negative numbers. We call these the rules for integers. They actually do work for fractions and decimals too, but the idea is practice on whole numbers when it's a little easier, get those rules down, and then we'll just have those rules forever as far as positives and negatives. All right, I hope that helped you guys, and I will see you in class tomorrow.